measles outbreak in California shows our collective immunity is at risk as many kids here lack vaccinations. How do the costs of a new stadium pencil out for the Chargers and for taxpayers? You may be surprised. And speaking of taxpayers, we may be asked to hike taxes for transportation improvements and open space preservation next year. I'm Mark Sauer, and the KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the top stories this week in San Diego. I'm Mark Sauer. And joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, our reporter Joanne Ferry of iNewsSource. Hi, Joanne.
Hi, Mark.
Good to have you here. UT San Diego business columnist Dan McSwain. Hi, Dan.
Hi, Mark.
Welcome. And Dean Calbreth of the San Diego Daily Transcript. Hi, Dean. Good to see you back.
Nice being here.
Well, the recent outbreak of measles traced to an unvaccinated visitor to Disneyland has brought into a problem into sharp relief: the risk posed by the refusal of some parents to have their children vaccinated on time or at all. Immunologists say it comes down to a choice between two fears. Joanne, why are some parents now deciding not to have their kids vaccinated?
Well, you've got sort of different reasons. You've got your hardcore anti-vaccinators who believe that they don't want to inject their kids with so-called chemicals. Of course, they're buying into propaganda. Also, a number of years ago, there was a researcher, Andrew Wakefield, who linked autism to the measles vaccine. Of course, that's been discredited. We know that's junk science, but still there is this small...
That idea hasn't gone away.
No, exactly. There's still a small group who buy into this. We had people like Jenny McCarthy, of course, a celebrity kind of propagate this idea. You've got other parents who want to delay certain vaccines. So they're on a different schedule. They're under-vaccinating their kids. They think they don't want to overload their kids with all of this stuff all at once. So they're under-vaccinated.
All right. And iNewsSource reported this week a surprising number of kindergartners in San Diego County are in this category of not being up to date or not vaccinated.
So,
what are the numbers showing?
Okay. So data journalist Joe Girardi put these numbers together. And basically what he found is that there are about 3,300 kids in kindergarten. That's about 8% who are under-vaccinated or not immunized at all. Now, that's actually an increase over the past decade. The number actually was about 10% last year. So there was a bit of an uptick, a bit down now. But over the past 10 years, we see this trend of a growing number of parents who are either not vaccinating or under-vaccinating. And
remind us of the diseases we're talking about here. It's a range of things.
It is. So the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, actually puts out a list of recommendations, and it says, here are all the vaccines we think kids ought to have and when they ought to have them. And they're against things like measles, polio, diphtheria, chickenpox, whooping cough. I mean, some of these diseases we never hear about anymore, and that's because everyone gets immunized.
The vaccinations work.
Exactly,
yeah.
They work. So some of them are these like old diseases that you don't hear a whole lot about.
Mm-hmm. And there's been press coverage around the world of this measles outbreak in California here. And why is it so scary? I mean, a lot of us who are a little older thought, oh, it's one of those kids' disease. Everybody kind of got it, chickenpox. What's the big deal?
Right.
But it's pretty dangerous.
Well, it is a big
some.
deal, absolutely. So it's the complications. I mean, it's one of those childhood diseases that if you get it and you get through it, good for you. But then there are the times when you can get anything from an ear infection to brain swelling to pneumonia. I think the CDC says for every 1,000 cases, 1 or 2 people will die. For kids under 5 or adults over 20, it's especially dangerous. So that's the thing. We had one scientist compare it to, wearing seatbelts, where most of the time you're going to be safe in a car, but you want to make sure it's not that one time where you're the kid who ends up with the brain swelling, or your kid ends up with that horrible complication.
Okay, we do have a clip from one parent who decided against vaccinations. That's Daniela Mieja from Imperial Beach, and Joe Girardi, your colleague, had asked her what she'd say to other parents about why she decided not to vaccinate her children. Let's hear that.
Surely you know there are people out there who are going to be watching this, and when they hear you say these things, they're going to think, she's a bad mother. She's endangering the life of her child.
Or their child.
Or their child.
I've heard that one the most.
What do you say to them?
I just acknowledge myself for my choices. I don't say anything to them. If they are invested in their point of view, then that will be their point of view. And I'm not going to defend mine.
All right, so I don't know, that doesn't seem a very definitive or forceful answer here. And I've heard some of the parents, I think it was quoted in the iNews Source story, saying, well, the other kids are vaccinated, so, you know, what's the big deal if my kid isn't?
Right.
But,
so here's where there's a lack of information out there. So one of the things we talk about in our reporting is herd immunity. So first of all, vaccines aren't 100% effective. They range. They can be maybe 70% effective, maybe 95% effective. We all know with the flu, you might get the flu shot, but you might still get the flu. So whooping cough's a good example of a vaccine that's not very effective, and so you might get immunized but still end up with whooping cough. Well, the same thing happens with the measles. So there are, first of all, there are people who can't be immunized because of medical reasons, right? You're going through chemotherapy, your immune system is somehow compromised, you can't get vaccinated. So first of all, that kid gets put at risk. But then even if you are immunized, there is a chance that you might still get the measles. Let's say the vaccine's 95% effective. 5% of the people who are immunized can still get sick. So you actually do put people at risk. Herd immunity means that enough of us are immunized that we keep the disease out of the herd, right? Out of the collective. So once that number drops off to a certain point where fewer and fewer people are immunized, we start jeopardizing that herd immunity.
you reach some sort of tipping point, it starts to take off again.
Exactly. And where that tipping point is, we asked a number of people, and it sort of varies depending on the disease. We had one medical researcher tell us that with the measles, it has to be somewhere at about 95%, whooping cough maybe at about 90%, but you read different papers, different research, and the number sort of fluctuates.
Well, disease like polio, which we were talking earlier, I happen to have as a child, and it's unheard of in this country. Certain countries you hear of a few cases now, but is it possible something like that could come back?
Well, that's a good question. So measles basically, technically, was eradicated in 2000. So this is why I bring it up, because what does that really mean? We believed in this country we didn't have it anymore. So we don't have polio anymore, right? Like, I don't think anyone's had polio in like 20 or 30 years.
I don't see it, right.
But if you have it somewhere else, right, and with international travel and everything else, that's really the danger. So you want to make sure we keep up our immunization levels to a certain point that we can't bring this disease back to the country, back to the U.S.
Okay. Now, we did have another bite here. This is an immunology professor from UC San Diego, Shane Crotty, and here's what he's saying about this issue about personal belief exemptions. We'll talk about that. Here's what he says.
Most of those personal belief exemptions are the majority, there's no solid numbers on it, but it looks like the majority of those are parents who have decided they're going to just slowly vaccinate their kids, so their kid finally gets immunized with everything by the age of 10 instead of the age of 4. And so the problem is you really need them vaccinated, fully vaccinated by the age of 4 or the age of 2, depending on the vaccine, so that you can really keep, first of all, protect those kids, but also provide the herd immunity that keeps the diseases from spreading.
All right, so he talked about personal belief. What's the law in California now? And I think there's a proposal to change it, right?
Right. So the law says there still is this so-called loophole that if you don't want to immunize your kid, as long as you talk to a healthcare practitioner about the risks, and that was actually a change in 2013, you can still say, no, I don't want my kid immunized. Well, now there's a proposal that says, let's get rid of that personal exemption sort of way of people opting out of this. You still have the medical exemption, again, because there are always going to be people who can't be immunized. So that just got introduced, I think it was just this week, actually.
Yeah, it's just news this week. And it was interesting because you were looking at who are the folks, the kind of parents who tend to not have their kids vaccinated, and it was kind of surprising.
It is. Well, it's actually the affluent, more affluent neighborhoods, people who are educated.
Money, education.
Yes, they tend to be in clusters. If you look at Joe Uriarte's searchable database, his map, you'll find that private schools tend to have more personal belief exemptions. So yeah, it's kind of surprising. I actually heard a story on NPR the other day too, and they're calling sort of these moms the so-called crunchy moms, right? Breastfeed longer, co-sleeping. There's sort of this sort of cultural kind of context to all of this as well.
Mm-hmm. And we only have a couple of seconds left here, but I did want to say it seems like all of a sudden we're hearing about vaccinations lately, and it's been in the news lately and in the last couple of years. Where did it come from? I mean, you mentioned at the outset that some of these folks had staying power by saying autism links and things like that, but is it the internet? Are people able to research this on their own?
I think it's that, and I think it's something else. We're working on another story for next week, and I think it also has to do with the further away we get from these diseases like polio and everything else, that we forget how bad they are.
There's a complacency.
Exactly. And so suddenly we're not afraid of them. And I think that's partly why you see these immunization rates sort of dropping off. So that's actually something we're looking at, a phenomenon we're looking at for next week.
Oh, good. Well, we'll look forward to that story, certainly. All right, we're going to move on now. The San Diego Chargers have spent a decade trying to make the case for a new stadium that would require a substantial amount of public funding. They still occupy Qualcomm Stadium, the Mission Valley edifice the team has called home for nearly 50 years. Now, Mayor Kevin Faulconer is making a push to finally resolve the stadium question with yet another task force. Dan, you looked at what kind of deal this might be, how the cost might break down. Start by telling us how much money are we talking about for a new football stadium here?
Well, the Chargers have been asking lately for a stadium costing about $1 billion. So it's a nice round number. 10 years ago, they said a new stadium at the Qualcomm site would cost about $400 million.
That's quite a bit more than $400 million, $1 billion.
It is, and big project construction indexes suggest that the number for that stadium would be closer to $600 million today. So they want a fancier stadium than they had envisioned 10 years ago, it appears.
Okay.
Now, is this in combination with the convention center expansion?
This is, regardless of site, that appears to be their price tag, or their wish, and that's about what the Minnesota Vikings stadium. That's essentially the cost for a brand new stadium these
Cowboys
days.
was a little north of that, right? And then of course, San Francisco up north here.
And the one up in Los Angeles could be a whole lot more than that.
Now, is this a good or bad business move for the Chargers here? I mean, aren't they making money where they are and the way things are in the old stadium?
Well, the Chargers have said for years, starting in about 2003, that we need a new stadium because under the NFL's revenue sharing system, a new stadium can have more luxury boxes and fancy club seating and sponsorship opportunities and some other things that will generate more local revenue for the team itself that doesn't have to be shared with the league. And they said to compete, we have to have more money. So I said, well, I guess a new stadium would produce more revenue. Is that sufficient to pay for a new stadium? So I did a real simple spreadsheet that said to borrow $1 billion for 20 years at 5% would cost about...
Interest rates are low, that's good.
Yeah, interest rates are low. That's good news for anybody, whether it's the city, county, or the Spanos family, the owners of the Chargers.
Right.
And that boils down to about $80 million a year in higher costs. And so I called around the country to sports experts, financing experts, and they said that the Chargers in a brand new stadium could expect about $50 million a year more in revenues. Okay. And I'm from Kentucky, but $50 million is
it's less than $80 million.
Is less than $80 million.
Yeah. That's a pretty sizable gap year to year.
It is.
Yeah.
So, to me, as a business columnist, that explains why the Spanos family hasn't gone ahead and built one themselves already.
Because it's not a good deal because a lot of casual fans might just say, hey, you want a new stadium? Go buy one. You're rich. Go pay for one. Get some investors.
Well, and not only that, in 1997, Qualcomm, the 50-year-old Qualcomm, was upgraded with new luxury suites and club seating, and that increased their revenue. Their local revenues on the order of $100 million this year.
Right.
So, in my view, the Qualcomm deal is so good that doing a new stadium compared to staying put is so far not a good business move.
Not really matching out. So break this down a little bit. You've got this $1 billion. Where would these big chunks, give us the ballpark figures, on where it would come from? How much from the Spanos folks? Maybe the NFL's kicking in something, low cost or no cost loan?
In Minnesota, they went 50-50 with the team,
private,
public and private, in rough numbers. The state of Minnesota, the city of Minneapolis, St. Paul, kicked in $500 million, a little more than that actually, and an NFL loan plus sale of personal seat licenses, they're called, paid for the other half. So using that model, that boils down to about $500 million from the public and $500 million from various sources from the team / NFL here. So I looked at that, and that boils down to, well, if everybody in the county, every household in the county was asked to participate, that's 500. There's about 1 million households, so that's $500 a household.
Yeah, okay. Well, that makes sense now in personal terms.
Yeah, real simple.
So what does the city get out of this? Is this a good deal for us public taxpayers here?
You know, the city likes these huge construction projects. The city likes it because the unions like it, because it employs more workers, because businesses like it, such as the Spanos family. Politicians, contributors like it, the people who fund their campaigns. So these kind of projects are often popular among city officials, and also what they look forward to is the ability to draw a Super Bowl to San Diego or something, which could be enhanced by this. But on the other hand, the question of how much public involvement is there for them, combined with President Obama's comments this week about the need to crack down on public funding of stadiums. The idea of making them less exempt from taxes and everything.
Yeah, Obama had that in his budget, didn't he not? Did he not? So it wouldn't be such a good deal for investors and others. I did want to point out, of course, you may have mentioned that Mayor Faulconer has this task force now, or I think I said it in the open. And, some people think the mayor just wants to get this issue out there, put it kind of the jury of the voters, as it were, but he's not really that invested in it. So we did ask him here on Evening Edition at KPBS what he thought about it. Let's see that clip.
We came together as a city and developed Petco Park. I think that works. I think we've seen the tremendous transformation of East Village. I've said, and I'm getting a group together that's going to look at all of the best practices. What's a plan that makes sense for us? A financing plan that keeps the Chargers in San Diego and one that protects taxpayers. I'm confident we can do that if we work together. There's a lot of priorities we're working on, but I think that's important as well.
All right. Of course, the big question there, and the mayor mentioned, is taxpayers. And depending on what they call this and how they structure it, it's going to have to be a big chunk of folks who back the thing, right? Is there stomach for that here?
Well, the economics is real clear. If you already have a football team, building a stadium to keep them doesn't have much economic improvement it doesn't generate new tax revenues. Super Bowl every 4 to 10 years is sure nice, but it certainly doesn't pay for a stadium. So I think what's really going on here is the stadium project in Los Angeles. That raises the possibility that the Chargers could leave and go to Los Angeles, and that is something that the city doesn't want to happen.
So then, Joanne,
that was actually my question. Is that a real threat?
Yeah.
Because we've been hearing about a new stadium for so long. So what's different now? And the Chargers may be going to LA. What has changed that suddenly we might have a decision?
Well, we now have. My theory is that for the last 20 years, the NFL has liked Los Angeles being empty because city by city across the country, teams could go to the cities and say, well, if you don't build us a new stadium, we're going to go to LA. Now almost every team in the country has a new stadium or a relatively new stadium with the skyboxes and the club seats and all the enhanced revenues. So that strategy has almost played itself out.
So push has come to shove. And you said you're going to be writing about this some more as we move along here, I'm sure.
This Sunday I look at the dream team, the LA power couple that is behind the latest stadium proposal.
Great.
And the one half of it is the owner of the LA Rams. Now, this is a genuine sports mogul. He owns 6 professional franchises. He has a TV network. He has a ticket sales company. This is somebody who knows how to bring a sports team to LA.
A big player. All right. Well, we'll certainly look for that one. Yeah. All right. So, speaking of taxpayers, we may get into to weigh in on a sales tax hike on the 2016 ballot, or likely more than one. SANDAG, that's the San Diego Association of Governments, is floating the idea of a half-cent sales tax increase, generating about $260 million a year. Dean, start by telling us what these additional funds would be used for.
Well, there is so far no specific about what they'll be used for, but the general categories are projects to reduce traffic congestion, either through mass transit or expansion of existing freeways, roadways, to either do that or to protect wetlands and open space commitments, as well as to do other projects to increase livability in the city, to introduce bike lanes, to get transit more close to people's houses and everything. These quality of life proposals were part of the Transnet tax that was introduced back in 1988 and reaffirmed in 2004. But part of that reaffirmation said you have to do these quality of life proposals eventually. You have to introduce them. And Sandag has been waiting for the opportunity to do this. It had postponed, it was going to go to, thinking about going to the voters back in 2008 to do this. And it postponed that because 2008 was a massive financial crisis. Nobody was
terrible time.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, water with a horrible drought, getting people behind anything that has to do with improving the water situation is maybe not a hard sell. But this other touchy-feely stuff, I mean, open space, we all love it. The beaches and Mission Bay and everything.
Too, right? Quality of life tax.
Right.
Like, yeah,
exactly.
I mean, that's a great way to sell it.
Because, yeah, you've got to sell it, but I mean, is that enough? Because we're not talking about just 50% vote here, right?
We aren't. We're talking about 2/3 vote.
Supermajority.
But part of this quality of life stuff is from state considerations. The state is putting pressure on them for wetlands and for open space. So they have to meet these commitments. Right. And that was part of their 2004 passage. Okay, we're going to meet these commitments with a separate funding bill. And now they've really got the metal is hitting the pedal in terms of that they've really got to go move on this. And they're beginning to talk about it. They're beginning to figure out the best strategy to get voters to support them on it.
Now, what is the strategy? You got two elections in that 2016 presidential year. You got the June primary, and then, of course, you got the general election in November. How do you pick and choose? Does it matter whether the Chargers happen to have something before voters or some other thing for the convention center? Or?
Well, that's their big concern because every 4 years, it's kind of like what they call the World Cup of tax initiatives, because every 4 years the voters come to vote for the president, and as they come to vote for the president, then all of these tax initiatives come out. This is when cities and counties think, okay, well, we've got the necessary voters that we want to see in the polls.
Let's see what
so let's hit them with taxes. Yeah. So there's going to be a whole laundry list of taxes in the 2016 ballots, possibly including the Chargers, possibly including a convention center, undoubtedly including infrastructure taxes from the city of San Diego and from other cities around, as well as school districts and other entities. So you've got a whole bunch of people who want to get support for their taxes. And if there's a laundry list there's a good chance the voters are going to say no to all of them. Right, I don't have time to sift through which ones I like and which ones I don't. So,
well, where would this, Dan, do we pay enough taxes now? Will people simply just be turned off by this whole laundry list, as we say? And, we're paying it high enough now. Other places in the country have cheaper sales taxes.
Well, I live in North County, and we have caught the short end of the Transnet tax hikes up to now. The original plan that added 0.5 cent to the countywide sales tax was supposed to turn Highway 76 into a regular freeway, and instead it's not, and it's really crowded. And
we hear
most of the money
reports every day, and that how it comes up.
Most of the money happened down in San Diego with very nice projects, the 52, the 56, improvements here and there. So other than, from North County's perspective, other than the Interstate 15 improvement, down yonder has gotten most of the money, and along with transit. So I think for North County to come on board again, which is essential to get a 2/3 majority, it has to be billed as an environmental quality of life. There's been talk off and on about beach sand replenishment, which I know business owners and city officials like.
Although north up there,
although some environmentalists and Surfrider do not like sand replenishment typically. So I think if it's greened up, it has a better chance, frankly.
Isn't the problem, though, always going to be this 2/3 majority? Because you will always have a certain segment that votes against all taxes or all tax increases no matter what, right? Because politically, that's what they believe. So reaching that 2/3 threshold, I mean, we saw what happened with school propositions where they lowered it, right? So you could have a new school tax.
Increased fire help after the 2007 wildfires.
Yes, exactly.
A lot of taxes get majority level support. It's that 2/3 that they have to face.
Right. What are the polls saying? We have any gauge of this yet?
There isn't.
You don't have a specific question and what's on the ballot, as we said.
The polls that they were looking for last year were polls of people who actually were invested in quality of, or were polls on how much voters were invested in quality of life. And 75% of the people or so were saying that that's very important to them, that they really appreciate the quality of life in San Diego. So if voters can be persuaded that this is a quality of life issue, then they'll support it. And that's their theory.
All right. Well, I know we're going to hear a lot more about that going forward and all these taxes and all these propositions as we move forward into 2016. Well, that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Joanne Farian of iNewsSource, Dan McSwain of UT San Diego, and Dean Calworth of the San Diego Daily Transcript. A reminder, all the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.